Following our series looking at that eventful day of 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, it's important to acknowledge the Somme was a battle of 141 days and not just about that single bloody day. 1st of July, of course, was a disaster, the worst single day in the history of the British Army in terms of casualties alone, with more than 57,000 officers and men being killed, wounded and missing. It took the Great War from an old world of warfare into a new one, and already lessons had been learned. And as we discovered from those recent episodes about the 1st of July, in some sectors new approaches to the fighting had been made, which would take the British Expeditionary Force forward quite literally in the coming weeks and months. And a good example of that is the dawn attack on the 14th of July, 2 weeks into the Battle of the Somme. So in this episode, we'll look at the history of the dawn attack that day, some stories of those involved in the battle, and do a short virtual walk of the ground as it is today. But first, what brought the army in the southern sector of the Somme to the point where another large-scale attack was possible? After the first day of the Somme, the ground between Mametz and Montauban, as well as some positions around Fricourt, were in British hands, some of the few gains from all that loss. Gradually, those gains were exploited with the capture of Fricourt village completely and the wooded areas beyond, and the rolling up of La Boisselle in the central part of the battlefield, and with it the approaches to Contalmaison, and in the very south, the capture of Bernafay Wood with a foothold before the next wooded area, Troneswood. Units were rotated through all of these positions during this period, including some which had been chewed up in the fighting on the 1st of July. The 34th Division was a good example of that, and as its shattered battalions received reinforcements, it advanced on the ground between Contalmaison and Mametz Wood. And with that part of the story, this is one of those moments where I can dip into, I guess, the collected research that I've done over the years through, for example, talking to the veterans, because one of the veterans that I got to know very well, who was in that retirement home in Worthing, Gifford House, that I've mentioned quite a few times on the podcast, was Frank Plum. He was a Suffolk lad from a little village called Copdock. His father was the postmaster there, and Frank had joined the Suffolk Cyclist Battalion and then proceeded overseas in that early summer of 1916 as a reinforcement draft to join another battalion of the Suffolk Regiment. And the battalion that he joined was the 11th Battalion, the Suffolks, who as part of that 34th Division had been almost annihilated in the early phase of the Battle of the Somme, in particular on the 1st of July, as they'd gone through the German lines and attempted to advance up Sausage Valley towards Contalmaison. And when Frank joined them, they were a shattered battalion in every kind of way. And I guess it gives us a bit of an example as to what it must have been like as a soldier like Frank Plum to join a new battalion as the new guy when the surviving veterans of the original battalion looked around and all the familiar faces that they'd once known were gone, killed, wounded or missing. But Frank fitted very well into that battalion, as many new men who joined these units did. And very quickly he became a section corporal and eventually a platoon sergeant, and would follow the battalion through the next phase of its history, its second tour of the Somme in that summer of 1916, where they were in this ground around Contalmaison and Mametz Wood, and then move up to Arras and take part in the fighting there, be wounded in the attack on Rouex, and then go on to fight at Third Ypres and in the Battle of the Lys, where he'd be very badly wounded in 1918. And I have told some elements of his story before, but I'm sure we will return to Frank. And it's just to put his little story in there because I think it's quite important to give a kind of face, I guess, if nothing else, to the men who were passing through units during this troubling stage beyond the 1st of July, where the British Army was trying to move its way forward again. So on the 7th of July, a new formation in this area, many of the others, as we've said, were ones that had been there since the beginning of the battle. A week in, new formations are coming down, and one of those who were being put into action for the first time in a major assault was the 38th Welsh Division, Lloyd George's army as it's often referred to. Now, we've spoken about them in the attack on Mametz Wood that day and in the following fighting for Mametz Wood that went on for the next week, with a secondary attack on the wood on the 10th of July, and eventually by the time of the dawn attack the wood had been cleared, but with the loss of thousands of those men from the Welsh Division, battalions of the Welsh Regiment, the South Wales Borderers and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. And today that battlefield is marked, as it has been since the 1980s, by that incredibly moving memorial of the Red Dragon with barbed wire clutched in its talons, looking out across that ground down into what became known as Death Valley and towards the promontory of the wood that jutted out, called the Hammerhead. So with major attacks like this, like the one on Mametz Wood, and the localised operations on the flanks of positions like this, gradually a rough line was formed from Contalmaison village across to the area of Mametz Wood, to Caterpillar Valley above Montauban, to the valley before Longueval, still in German hands, and to Bernafay Wood, the new front line, which was now facing Trones Wood, and beyond that were the open fields to the next village, the village of Guillemont. And this would be the front line where elements of Lieutenant General Horne's 15th Corps and Lieutenant General Congreve's 13th Corps would make the next big attack and leap forward. These army corps were collections of divisions, each one of those made up of anything up to 15 to 20,000 men, depending on whether they'd been in action since or after the 1st of July. There were normally multiple divisions in a corps, so a typical corps could be anything from 40 to at least 80,000 men, depending on what he was doing, what kind of major operation it was involved in. Some of the units that were in these two army corps had been in action on the first day. Others were regular divisions who had battle experience dating back to 1914 in some cases, and many of the new army battalions had fought at the Battle of Loos in 1915. Volunteers to a man, but with many new faces in almost all of the battalions one way or another, but reflecting the changing nature of the warfare of the Somme was becoming, and how the army was changing and reacting to the heavy losses and replacing men from depots and reserve battalions and other units, just like Frank Plum coming from the Cyclist Battalion into the 11th Suffolks. But this battle that lay ahead of all these men was going to be a different type of battle to the 1st of July, not launched in the bright sunshine of a summer's morning with the intention to attack made clear to the Germans. This was going to take place in the darkness, using the best of lessons learned from the artillery as this battle, this mighty battle, had rolled on. But it was still a gamble, and the fear was, would it be another 1st of July? At 3:20 a.m. on the 14th of July 1916, the night sky was torn apart with a great roar of flame, as the official historian called it, a massive British bombardment which dropped on the German lines. On the front from close to Mametz Wood across to Trones Wood, on what the battle's nomenclature committee would name the Bazentin Ridge, because of the two small villages of that name in the centre position of the battlefield, British guns dropped thousands of shells onto a surprised enemy. Joined by trench mortars of all calibres, and with Vickers machine guns firing into the darkness on fixed lines laying down indirect machine gun barrages, the effect on the enemy was considerable. Incredibly, this lasted only 5 minutes, not days and days of shell fire, just 5 minutes. A short, sharp, concentrated bombardment. There was no shortage of artillery in this area, and the proportion of guns used, with a distinct advantage to the British, echoed the similar success at Montauban 2 weeks before. That a night advance, a dawn attack, was about to take place was incredible in its own right, as nothing on this scale had ever been attempted before. Elements of 5 infantry divisions from 2 army corps, some of them veterans of 1st of July, some in action for the first time on the Somme, had been assembled to attack and bite hard and deep into the next part of the German defences in this southern sector. On each divisional front, at least 2,000 men went over the top, meaning that more than 20,000 attacked in the first wave on a battlefield less than 5 miles wide. But getting the plan to this point had been difficult. The idea of a dawn assault had been put forward in the week or so, and 4th Army Commander General Sir Henry Rawlinson had generally favoured the idea from Congreve and Horn, but the Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig had been less enthusiastic. He had real and valid concerns that to pull off a sizable night operation manoeuvre in peacetime with regular soldiers would have been difficult in its own right. So with citizen soldiers, men who'd been civilians just a few months before, in wartime conditions, this whole thing might be impossible. Arguments went back and forth. Rawlinson pushed for the idea to be taken forward, and finally GHQ sanctioned it, and the plan was greenlit for the morning of the 14th of July. In the lead-up, it was discovered that the Germans had tapped into one of the brigade headquarters telephone systems in this area and had picked up on details of a forthcoming attack. And all commanders at every level in this operation knew that the battle rested on absolute secrecy. So in an early 20th century example of battlefield deception, a decision was made to allow the Germans to continue to listen in, and some convincing conversations stating the attack had been called off were made, fooling the Germans successfully. Assembling the men proved problematic, with each fold in the Somme chalk downland suddenly mattering more than ever to cover the move of men getting forward for the assault, and in some areas heavy guns had cratered the ground, creating cover with shell holes for the men when they were assembling for the attack. Physical marks using tape, wooden markers, and even men, brigade majors and other officers, coordinated the movement of thousands of soldiers in the darkness, so that just prior to 0 hour, many units were less than 500 yards from the German front line. One of the brigade majors assisting was General Congreve's own son, Billy Congreve, who was a regular soldier, now a brigade major in the 3rd Division. Within a week of this battle, he'd be dead on the battlefield, and the recipient of a posthumous Victoria Cross, meaning both father and son had been awarded Britain's ultimate decoration for gallantry. Some units got a bit too keen with the assembly phase, and in one sector units began to move forward independently of their orders, resulting in a distance of less than 120 yards to the German trenches by the time 0 hour came around. Now this was way beyond what was thought possible under these kind of wartime conditions, in what was essentially an evolving way of warfare at this time. And all of this had been achieved with the minimum of fuss, without alerting the Germans, and with only a handful of casualties in most cases. A new modern army was beginning to emerge from the carnage of that summer's day of the 1st of July, and it was men from that army which moved forward in enough darkness to shield them and enough half light to see what they were doing at 3:25 a.m. on that morning of the 14th of July. 3:25 was 0 hour. On the far left, the 110th Brigade, made up of the 4 Leicester Powell's battalions, moved forward to the Bazentin-le-Petit wood and got into the German trenches here just as the guns lifted their fire. On their immediate left flank, machine gun fire held them up, but the bombers moved forward, men with grenades, led by the battalion commander of the 8th Leicesters, Lieutenant Colonel Mignon, and the position was cleared, but he was killed in the process. Bazentin-le-Petit wood was taken. The Leicesters dug in on the far side, facing open fields, and linked up with units on their left, around Contalmaison and opposite Pozières. The neighbouring village of Bazentin-le-Petit was attacked by units from the Leicester's neighbours, the 7th Division. Now this village was, despite its name Bazentin-le-Petit, the small Bazentin was actually of the bigger of the 2 Bazentins, and it was dominated by quite a large chateau where the French scientist Lamarck had lived. He was one of those who had put forward a theory of the evolution of species at the same time as Darwin, and the chateau, by the time of the Great War, had been essentially turned into a kind of museum. The Germans had taken it out, moved out all of the important pieces, and turned it into a headquarters and a medical post. It was a dressing station for their wounded. And within the village itself, a lot of the buildings had been fortified. In the valley beyond was quite a lot of their artillery, close to a wooded area where there was a quarry. So it was set up as a defensive position. But the trenches were now either side of it. To the north was the main German line, and to the south was the original trenches, which had been rolled up in the early phase of the battle. So when those units of the 7th Division crossed over the forward German positions and got into villages like Bazentin-le-Petit, it was open ground. There were no trenches, defences, very little barbed wire, and it was more conventional fighting in that way. So the Royal Irish, for example, linked up with the POWs in Bazentin Wood. The 2nd Queens of that 7th Division came up towards the wooded area around the quarry in that eastern part of the village, facing towards the open ground itself, which would lead to high wood in the distance. British field artillery were then brought up because by this stage of the battle, infantry are only as good as the guns that can protect them. So the field artillery came up, set up new positions close to the village to protect the gains that had been made. And as had happened on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in this southern sector, Royal Engineer field companies and infantry pioneers moved in to help consolidate the gains, as in most cases, as we said, the German trenches had been passed and new positions needed to be dug. In the centre near Bazentin-le-Grand, units of the 3rd Division swept over the skyline, were slowed down by German uncut wire in one place, but broke through to the large farm which formed the village. So, unlike Bazentin-le-Petit, Bazentin-le-Grand was not really a village, it was a hamlet built around quite a large farm complex. And from there, the troops moved on to the Contalmaison-Longueval road just beyond, around a crucifix on a road junction there, which soon became known as Crucifix Corner. Bazentin-le-Grand had been taken by the 1st Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers, and the position looked secure, although officer losses in this area had been pretty heavy, including 4 battalion commanders, 2 of whom had been killed on the field of battle. On their right, the Scottish battalions of the 9th Scottish Division swept over the far end of Caterpillar Valley, moving towards the long valley that led to Longueval village, and beyond it the mass of Bois Delville Wood. The German accounts here state that the assault by the Jocks was assisted by flamethrowers as well as the artillery fire, and despite some uncut wire, the Scottish battalions of the 2 brigades that attacked got into the ruined houses of the village, and fighting then moved from house to house. So again, this is very different to standard trench fighting of this period. The Royal Scots reached the edge of the village towards the mass of Delville Wood on the far side, and the divisional engineers here too moved up and helped consolidate in places where there were no trenches. It was essentially all virgin ground around villages like Longueval, and once again the German defences were now either behind them or on the far side of, in this case, Delville Wood. On the very far right, the Kitchener Army battalions of the 18th Eastern Division, who had been in action on the first day of the Somme, faced towards Trones Wood from the stunted trees of Bernafay Wood which had fallen on the 3rd of July. Although they were in theory not part of the main assault this day, and here to hold the flank alongside the French on their immediate right, with the collapse of the German lines that morning, battalions were sent into Trones Wood to push the Germans back here too. Lieutenant Colonel Maxwell, a veteran of the Boer War who'd be killed at Ypres in 1917 as a brigade commander, led his 12th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, in alongside the 6th Battalion Northamptonshire Regiment. The 6th Northants described their assault in their unit history as like a shoot in a wood in peacetime, as they fought their way into the shattered wood with no discernible main trench system, although there was some trenches cutting across bits of the wood. It was a fight from tree to tree, ride to ride, shell hole to shell hole, and they used this analogy of it being like a shoot in a wood in peacetime because it was like flushing pheasants out of the undergrowth. As they were moving forward, the rifle sections and the machine guns, the Lewis machine guns, were opening fire, flushing the Germans out, forcing small pockets of resistance to fight back, and gradually the Northants and the Middlesex on their flanks flushed these men out and push them back. This kind of wood fighting that had been going on in Mametz Wood for a week was going on simultaneously in Bazentin-le-Petit as the Leicesters pushed through there and dug in on the far side. And then those units of the 18th Eastern Division were doing it here. This, again, was very different to the kind of warfare that these men had become used to. The kind of trench battles, fighting within the trenches and the confines of a front line and no man's land, this was very different. It was fluid, and they were in open ground or fighting through woodland, and it took some getting used to. And fighting in woods is always difficult, particularly when you've got to stop and consolidate, because in the summer, with the full undergrowth up, and also the trees all around you, and more importantly, their roots in the ground, it's very difficult to dig in under those conditions, and it takes a lot more than an entrenching tool normally, even to dig a scrape in the ground that you can use as a defensive position. In the confused battle that followed, gradually in Trones Wood, the Germans were pushed to the very tip of the pear shape of the wood. The flanks were consolidated by other battalions of the division, and as the Germans withdrew across the open ground towards Longueval, machine gun fire from the Lewis guns took their toll. And so right across that front on this dawn of the 14th of July, the battle had been a success. The German line had been overrun, the entire second line position captured on a front of 6,000 yards from Contalmaison across to Bazentin, Longueval and Trones Wood. Major General Sir Archibald Montgomery, Chief of Staff of Rawlinson's Fourth Army, had promised the French on their flanks that the Longueval Ridge would be taken by 8 in the morning, or he'd eat his hat. So sure he was of the success that was to come. So when the news of that success was passed to the disbelief of the French, they were assured that the general was not about to take his hat off, let alone eat it. And one of the lessons from that early phase of the Battle of the Somme was ensuring that your reserves were not too far away. And for this battle, reserves were moved up quite quickly. So at Longueval, for example, the village having been taken by the 2 Scottish brigades of the 9th Scottish Division, the newly formed South African Brigade, here in action for the very first time, moved up through the village and entered Delville Wood, with Brigadier General Lukin commanding the brigade, sending his men towards the far edge of the wood in all directions, facing towards the village of Ginchy, Ginchy in one direction and Flers beyond, to await any German attacks, and they didn't have to wait long before those attacks came in. But while ahead of most troops that morning was open, unoccupied ground empty of the enemy, headquarters forbade them to exploit it and decided instead to hold fast. This related more to the way communications hampered mobile operations like this, where command and control was frustrated, to say the least. With static communication systems like telephone lines, which had to be laid across ground to open up the ability for one unit to talk to a headquarters, or you relied on signal sections that sent back messages via lamps or flags, or you relied on runners or pigeons, all of this could break down very, very quickly indeed in these kind of mobile battles, which is why those in the high command position were reluctant to send men too far forward, because it was even less possible to control them. Cavalry patrols and staff officers had walked or ridden into places like High Wood and found them pretty much unoccupied. But how to make an advance beyond the stated objectives possible given all these constraints? Units from the 2nd Indian Cavalry Division had been moved up through Death Valley near to Mametz Wood, but it would be very late in the day that the 7th Dragoon Guards and the 20th Deccan Horse from the division were ready to be committed to a battle, while the 1st South Staffs and 2nd Queens assembled alongside them. The plan was to try and take High Wood with a swift cavalry probe, so make something of this changing situation, a situation which you can now exploit given the success, but within the constraints of what you had on the battlefield and how you could control that. The 20th Deccan Horse became, in this attack, the first Indian Army unit to go into action in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. 2/3 of this unit were Muslim, the rest Hindu Jats from the Punjab. And the plan was, while the infantry moved into position where they could essentially follow up to consolidate the objective, High Wood, because cavalry can advance and screen a position, but they can't necessarily capture and hold it. That's what you need the infantry for. The plan was to move these two cavalry units, 20th Deccan Horse, 7th Dragoon Guards, one cavalry unit in the case of the Deccan Horse with lances, and the other, the Dragoon Guards, with sabres. You'd send these men, move them up, and assemble close to the open ground around that crucifix corner and move into the open fields beyond. And this is exactly what happened on the evening of the 14th of July when that cavalry attack went in at 7 p.m. Now, many books on the First World War have described this as a massacre, as a crazy use of cavalry, of how stupid generals were to send cavalry forward into the attack, but actually that couldn't be anything further from the truth. Cavalry was kept back so often like this for this very moment where a situation had become fluid, an opportunity was there to exploit that situation, and you needed fast-moving troops to do it, and that's exactly what cavalry could do. So to send cavalry forward like this, where you knew a position ahead was pretty much empty of enemy troops, where you had troops on the flanks to potentially protect them, where you had gunners to observe as well and bring down artillery fire if that was needed, and where you had infantry available, in this case 2 battalions, to move up after them to actually consolidate and hold the position that they might reach. So the cavalry moved over this open ground in the dimming light of the day towards the objective, the dark mass of High Wood they could see on the skyline, the gap with the open ground between High Wood and way across to their right Delville Wood. And once they got into the open, there was very little to oppose them. There was some German machine gun fire. A British aircraft from the Royal Flying Corps up above the battlefield spotted a German machine gun opening up on the cavalry and dived down and silenced it. And while on one level, hundreds of these cavalry troopers moving across open ground in good visibility were potential targets for the enemy, there were so few of the enemy there that no one opened up on them. And the Germans that were there saw these 2 cavalry regiments, one with lances and one with gleaming swords, sabres coming straight at them. You'd have to be the best troops in the world to stand against that. And a lot of the Germans broke and ran under those conditions. There is quite a few first-hand accounts of this attack, and one of them reads, "As each squadron cleared the defile, it formed line and advanced at gallop in the direction taken by the advance guard, which lay through a broad belt of standing corn, in which small parties of the enemy lay concealed. Individual Germans now commenced popping up on all sides, throwing up their arms and shouting 'Kamerad,' and not a few, evidently under the impression that no quarter would be given, flung their arms around the horses' necks and begged for mercy, all of which impeded the advance. It was about this time that one of our aeroplanes came over, flying very low and firing tracer bullets to show the positions of hostile machine guns, and also that of a German trench which ran from High Wood to Delville Wood, and which, owing to the corn, was invisible. When the advance guard reached its objective, a German trench to the north of Delville Wood, occupied by infantry, could be seen clearly, and German artillery, located by the flash of guns, opened fire. During the whole period of the advance, the regiment had been exposed to flanking machine gun fire from Delville Wood." Now, despite all of this, despite German trenches with infantry in, despite field guns, machine gun fire, the casualties were fairly minimal. When you go to that battlefield today, there's only a handful of graves from this attack. But one thing cavalry can't do, although all of these men are trained to fight on the ground as well as from horseback, so they don't have carbines anymore as they would have done the generation before, they have short magazine Lee-Enfield rifles and can fight as well as any infantry soldier. They could not hold this ground indefinitely, because if they dismounted, then they'd have to use some of their personnel to mind the horses, find a place to put the horses so they didn't become casualties, and it could get very messy indeed. But thankfully, the infantry did catch up. High Wood was reached, but not taken, and as darkness fell on a long, long day, the Royal Engineers assisted the infantry to consolidate, often having to put down their shovels and fight with rifles as the Germans reacted to the arrival of cavalry and then the arrival of infantry, and the German counterattacks in this area grew in intensity. It was a day of success in the morning, lost opportunities in the afternoon, and to a certain extent the same in the evening. Despite that, move forward to take the edge of High Wood. If that bold move had happened hours before, then perhaps the outcome of battle this day could have been even better than it already was. The massive leap forward on the 14th of July had shown that dawn attacks could and would work, but the cost had been more than 9,000 officers and men killed, wounded and missing. So even the price of victory was high. All that sacrifice had brought them to High Wood with its dark and foreboding trees, which would soon become one of the most deadly cornerstones of the battle in the coming months of that Somme summer. Beyond the battles and the tactics and the what-ifs and the change in the very nature of war fighting on the Somme, there's always the human story. And to illustrate that, we'll end with the stories of a couple of men who took part in the dawn attack, one in the ranks, the other an officer. And then we'll walk the ground virtually from one flank to another. The first of these accounts that I've selected is by I.L. Reid from a book called Of Those We Loved. Now, I've mentioned this book a few times on the podcast. It's one of my favourite memoirs, not just because I.L. Reid was a Sussex lad. Isaac Leonard Reid, always known as Dick Reid to his mates, was born in Eastbourne in June 1895, the son of a watchmaker and jeweller. The eldest of 5 children, 3 of his brothers would also serve, and all would survive the war. Dick Reid was educated at Eastbourne Grammar School, a good local school, and cut short his education for an engineering apprenticeship in Leicester, which is where he was when war broke out in August 1914. Instead of coming back to Sussex to join the South Downs or the Royal Sussex, he instead enlisted in the 8th Leicesters in September 1914, went to France with them in July 1915, and served in the quiet sector between Arras and the Somme, and then in the Battle of the Somme and at Arras in 1917, and rose to the rank of sergeant. He was then given a commission in the 4th Royal Sussex Regiment in October 1917. They were out in Palestine. He joined them there. Then that battalion, the 1st 4th Royal Sussex, moved back to France, and he served with them, for example, in the 2nd Battle of the Marne and in the 4th Battle of Ypres in 1918. And what I've got here is an extract from his account of the dawn attack. He also illustrates his account with his own watercolours and sketches, which are reproduced in the book. I think in a newer version they might even be in colour. But this is what he saw, some of what he saw in that attack on the 14th of July. As we prepared to move, we noticed that dawn was breaking. 1,000 shells seemed to whistle over our heads at once, then pandemonium indescribable as the preliminary bombardment of the German positions commenced. The enemy retaliated, but such was the noise that we could not hear their shells coming at all, saw great bursts quite close, and were smothered and bruised several times with earth, leaves and tree bark. To speak to my mate Jackie, I had to cup my hands and shout into his ear. Just then we saw Colonel Mignon clambering over the fallen trees in our direction, ash plant in hand, with which he thrust aside the undergrowth, bending low here and there and shouting encouragement to the men as he passed. And it wasn't long after that I already saw Colonel Mignon go forward, that he joined that bombing party and tried to push through the German positions there, and he was killed. Reid goes on to describe the fighting within the wood and on the edge of the wood that day in graphic detail. But for me, one of the most moving parts of it is the aftermath of the battle, when they've come out of the line and they're looking around and seeing the depleted ranks of their battalion. And this is how he describes it. We watched the fatigue party bringing up our rations, dumping piles of bulging sandbags on the ground near us, and this set us running through the names of our mates we knew already to be killed, wounded or missing. Both of us had lost all our best pals, and we sat there with leaden hearts, lost in our thoughts. Eventually Jackie broke the silence. "Plenty of rations tonight, Dick," nodding towards the pile. "Enough for the whole battalion, eh?" "About 6 times too many." He added bitterly, "Christ, there'll be hell to pay in Leicester and Loughborough and Colville and Melton and Uppingham when they know about this. The Leicester Brigade, eh? Bloody well wiped out." And he tailed off into silence again, immersed in his thoughts. For I.L. Reid, this was his first time in action, but he went right through the war. The book is an amazing account of his experiences. He came home, returned to Eastbourne, married in 1921. He later moved to the New Forest and named his house after one of the villages north of the Somme where he'd been in action for quite some time in 1915, and he served again in World War II. Dick Reid died in 1971, and his book sadly wasn't published in his lifetime, wasn't published until the 1990s, and then privately. But it's been reprinted, I think, by Pen and Sword now, and it is one of those books that I can't recommend enough. All of his material, his original material, has been saved and is in the First World War archive at Leeds University. So Dick Reid's the first face of this battle, an ordinary soldier in the ranks of the Leicester Powers. The second one that I wanted to mention to you is Major Geoffrey Brooke Parnell. Geoffrey Brooke Parnell was a regular soldier who was born in Ireland in 1882 from a military family and grew up in Sussex and Surrey, and had served with the Army Service Corps in the Boer War and was subsequently commissioned in 1903 as a second lieutenant in the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. For many years he'd been based in the barracks in Guildford before the Great War and had become very much part of the local community there. Today there's a memorial to him in Guildford High Street, placed there by his sister, a children's author and illustrator called Edith Farmelow. Major Parnell was a cousin of the 5th Baron Congleton, who'd been killed at the First Battle of Ypres, buried in Zillebeek churchyard, and they were part of a group of 14 cousins who were serving in the army on the outbreak of war, Parnell, when he fell in the Battle of the Somme, being the 7th one to die on the battlefield. Parnell himself had been on the Western Front since November 1914, rising from company commander to now battalion commander and acting lieutenant colonel of the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Regiment, and he led them into action to capture the ground around the village of Bazentin-le-Petit. They moved up and fought along the Bazentin to High Wood Road, where Parnell was killed on the 15th of July by machine gun fire, leading his men into action against the third line of German trenches in this area and uncut wire, according to one account. Originally buried in a battlefield cemetery west of Bazentin Wood, his grave was moved to Flatiron Copse Cemetery in the 1920s. While his grave shows his substantive rank of major, as we've said, he was actually a lieutenant colonel and amongst the 1st Battalion commanders to fall in the fighting around High Wood. And exactly 2 months later, after 2 months of solid fighting for that wood, one of his old friends, Arthur Percival Hamilton, also of the Queen's Regiment and now commanding the 1st 19th Battalion of the London Regiment, fell at High Wood too in the final battle for the wood on the 15th of September 1916. He was originally buried at Bazentin-le-Grand, and his grave too was moved to Flatiron Copse after the war. And now the old friends are not only in the same plot of the cemetery, but actually in line with each other, standing guard over these battlefields with thousands of others for all time. And Parnell and Hamilton are all part of those criss-cross pathways of the Great War for me, because I have original photographs of both of them, and when I brought them to the Somme and found out where they were buried and how they were buried so closely together, two old friends who'd fought on the same battlefield, both battalion commanders, both killed on the same ground but exactly 2 months apart, and there they were resting together. It's one of those strange coincidences of the Great War that is never really a coincidence. And so to end this episode, we'll take a walk, a virtual walk together now, across this Bazentin Ridge battlefield, the site of the dawn attack of the 14th of July 1916, to get a flavour of what that ground is. And it's something you can do in reality in just a few hours. You can park up in Contalmaison and do a big loop walk across the battlefield, around all the key locations, and loop yourself back to Contal-Maison. It's something that I would thoroughly recommend. So starting on the grounds just outside the village of Contal-Maison, we've left the village, we're on the road that continues all the way to Longueval. The ground dips on the outskirts of the village down towards that northwestern edge of Mametz Wood. We can look down the valley to our right where in the early stage of the battle, post 1st of July, lots of units were involved in that bit of ground there, trying to push towards Mametz Wood itself. We come up to the bit of the wood that the men of the Welsh Division reached on the 14th of July, kind of handing that ground over to units like the 110th Brigade, the Leicester Pals, as they then pass through them, continue with the assault at dawn on towards the next wood. And as we come up out of that dip and the ground levels off slightly and we follow the edge of Mametz Wood, we can see across the fields to our left the expanse of Bazentin-le-Petit Wood. Now, it's probably one of the least visited of the Somme woods on the battlefield today because there's no memorial there, there's no battlefield cemetery there, there's no information panel, but yet it was the scene of this terrific fight with the 4 Leicester Pals battalions on the 14th of July 1916 and saw their virtual destruction there. And it's worth pausing to remember that as you look across these fields, perhaps with I.L. Reid's book in your hand, reading his account of it. And if we continue along this road, we can look down into the far end of Death Valley to our right. We can perhaps see Flatiron Copse Cemetery tucked in the dip there up against the trees of the wood, where Major Parnell and Colonel Hamilton are buried so closely together, and including some of the Leicester Pals in there and so many others connected to this story of the Dawn attack as well. And that brings us up to where there's a crossroads of roads and tracks, and we can turn left here and follow that track roughly uphill and into the village of Bazentin-le-Petit. It comes out in the part of the village where, to your left, there's a tree-lined avenue with a statue at the end of it, which is a statue of Lamarck, the French scientist who had his own version of the evolution of species, and that's where his chateau was, which had been the German headquarters and medical post prior to the Battle of the Somme. It was never rebuilt. To your right, there's a more modern memorial. It was put up, I think, on the 250th anniversary of Lamarck, which shows a giraffe made out of 2CV parts. It's a rather curious thing. And why a giraffe, you may say? Well, his theory of the evolution of species revolved around giraffes having long necks so they could reach up and eat food up in the trees. I mean, before we go down another kind of rabbit hole there, that's what this is about. So, standing here, we're in the kind of heart of the village. The church is just up on our left, and on the steps of the church there is a memorial to the Leicester lads. There's a track going off to the right that takes you down to where the quarry and the wooded area was, where Bazentin-le-Petit Communal Cemetery Extension is located, and we've spoken about that part of the battlefield recently on the YouTube channel. That's where Robert Graves was wounded in the follow-up to this fight here. Major Parnell was killed on the far side of the village from where we're standing. So we're going to turn right, drop down away from the village itself. The road drops down the hill, rejoins that Longueval road. We'll turn left, go up to Crucifix Corner. The original crucifix that stood there in 1916 is still there amongst the trees. You can see part of the foot of Christ is blown off by shrapnel, and his body is pierced by shrapnel as well. It's the original figure of Christ that stood on the crucifix there, an incredible Somme survivor. There are 2 tracks here, one that goes off to the left, and if you walk up there you can see a kind of grass-covered mound. That's the old Bazentin-le-Petit windmill. Frank Richards of Old Soldiers Never Die fame. That's where he had his signal post, again after the capture of the village. He was there with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers at the same time as Robert Graves. The other track to the right, if you followed it, would take you all the way to High Wood, and is roughly in line where the cavalry assault went in on the 14th of July. So if you walk up there a little way, crest the high ground there, you are standing just in front of the position where the cavalry assembled, and you can follow their route either side of this track towards the wood. You can see that gap between High Wood and Delville Wood, and you can see where the cavalry moved forward in this assault on the night of the 14th of July. We'll then continue along the road. Over to our right is the rebuilt farm complex that forms the village, the name village of Bazentin-le-Grand. As you can see today, it's pretty much the same size as it was in 1916. It's not much of a village. It's basically one collection of farm buildings. And then we can follow that up to Caterpillar Valley Cemetery, where on the raised part of that cemetery we've got exceptionally good views across the battlefield here towards High Wood, again where the cavalry went in. And if we carry on towards the edge of Longueval, there's a fairly new memorial there to the 20th Deccan Horse and the Indian cavalry that took part in this attack. That'll take us into Longueval village itself. We'll see the Piper on the corner, the Piper Memorial, to commemorate the pipe bands of British and Commonwealth units that served in the Great War here because of the connection with the 9th Scottish Division. Quite a few of the battalions on the 14th of July were piped into action as they attacked the village in that dawn of the 14th of July 1916. And we could carry on to go to the edge of Delville Wood to see where the Scottish battalions reached that ground there and where the South Africans then entered the wood. There's a marker stone on the edge of the wood indicating where the South African Brigade first went in, but that is a story that we've covered in a previous podcast. So we're going to turn right here, come out of Longueval village. You'll go past Longueval Road Cemetery, where there's a good view towards Montauban, and you can see the ground where the 9th Scottish Division attack came in on the 14th of July towards the village itself. You come to Bernafay Wood Cemetery, which has got men who were killed in the fighting here on the 14th of July and some of the later battles as well. And as we come up to the crossroads on the outskirts of Montauban village, we can go left here and come up to that bit of ground between Bernafay and Trones, where the 18th Eastern Division held the flank alongside the French. And then on the 14th of July, those two battalions we mentioned, 12th Middlesex and the 6th Northants, went in. And if we walk a bit further down the road here, we come across the memorial to the 18th Eastern Division, because they had an unusual distinction here in that they fought and took the wood in July 1916, Trones Wood, and then 2 years later, in August 1918, had to do it all over again because this ground had been lost in the Spring Offensive in March 1918, and it was the same division who found itself back on the same battlefield attacking the same ground. So when it came to placing one of several memorials that they have on the Western Front, Trones Wood was an obvious location because of the symbolism of those two battles here 2 years apart in 1916 and 1918. And then just before we get into those vast open fields that lead us to Guillemont, and we can see Guillemont Road Cemetery just ahead of us, we're going to turn left onto the track, and this takes us up the edge of Trones Wood, up towards the far end of this big pear-shaped wood, where the 6th Northants, having flushed out the Germans in the undergrowth, pushed them into the open ground beyond, where they were taken down by the Lewis guns of the battalion. And that then linked up the units from this division with the 9th Scottish Division attack towards Longueval and Delville Wood, and again towards the French on their right. And if you look in the far distance towards Hardycourt, you might just see the large cross that stands on the site of Mountshawn Farm, and that's very close to the boundary between the British and the French soldiers in this sector. We'll continue along the track back into Longueval, and then we can cross and head back towards Contalmaison, having done that big loop around the Dawn attack battlefield. For many units in this battle, this was their first time over the top. For others, this was their second time in action on the Somme, and perhaps their third or fourth time going into battle. Each place, each location, each story, each loss of comrades changed them slightly. These were the things that they would reflect on when they eventually came home. And as always, we have to remember that most men returned from the Battle of the Somme. They didn't all die there. In the infantry, 1 in 5 were killed, 3 in 5 were wounded. And that meant, of course, that very few men walked away with no kind of injury, having served in the PBI, the Poor Bloody Infantry, in the front line in battles like this. But the men who came home reflected back. They'd seen perhaps the disaster of the 1st of July and then taken part in this incredible dawn assault which had achieved so much. On one level, ground like this is perhaps worthless. Open farmland, a remote corner of northern France. But here on the Somme, it helped define how the battle, the war, was changing. And for the men who fought here, lost their mates here, and thought of how it had affected the communities they knew back home, it would take on a deeper meaning, a deeper significance, as a place where blood had been shed and where comrades should always be remembered. Layers of that culture of a soldier's experience, of that culture too, of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.